Good afternoon. I'm Rohini Pandey. I'm a professor in the economics department and the director of the Economic Growth Center, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this conference, which is really about the many areas of research that have been started by and inspired by Naomi's work. And as you can see from just this room, Naomi's work is incredibly interdisciplinary. We have both the chair of the history and the economics department here, which is just a testament of, I think, very few people in Yale span as much as Naomi did in her time here. And for this reason, we're also delighted that our Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science, Tamar Gendler, who herself spans many fields, is going to be opening up. So Tamar is the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. She is the Vincent J. Scully Professor of Philosophy and a Professor of Psychology and Cognitive Science. So Tamar, over to you to open us up.
Thank you so much, Rohini. And thanks so much to all of you. I am so honored to be in this room with you. This is the room where the Directed Studies lectures now take place. Directed Studies is a program that Yale has been running for more than 80 years that introduces a group of first-year students who select to be part of the program to a set of classic texts from the Western philosophical and literary and historical traditions. So they start with the pre-Socratic philosophers, and they end up with Hannah Arendt, and they start with the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they end up in 20th century literature, and they start by reading Herodotus and Thucydides, and they end up in contemporary political theory. And what they ask and what they learn to discuss in that room are the fundamental questions of what it is that allows human beings to flourish. And one of the extraordinary things that I realized as I was preparing to speak about Naomi's contributions is how centrally the set of tools that she brings from a complementary set of disciplines seek to answer the same questions. What are the conditions under which we can build structures that allow human beings and the societies that they constitute and that shape them to flourish? So I was looking through the 2017 volume that Naomi edited called Organization, Civil Society, and the Roots of Development. And did I misspeak? I got a heckle that I didn't hear. My apologies. I come from a debate background. A co-author, okay. Co-author. Sorry, I don't mean that Naomi. I mean that Naomi, along with her colleagues, as with everything that seems individual, it is partly the result of a group effort, and as with every group effort, it is constituted by individuals, and I was focusing only on these two boundary conditions when I was speaking about the individual. Do I get now a pass to continue with my quotation? So the Naomi and her colleagues write, this volume starts from the premise that modern developed societies are rich and secure in large measure because individual citizens possess the right to form organizations, and because they have access for this purpose to a set of legal tools that the government provides to everyone on essentially the same terms. Naomi's intellectual work has, with a depth that is really breathtaking, and a precision that is really unusual, excavated these claims. The work that Naomi has done on the ways in which the consistent application of legal standards is a presupposition for allowing a certain kind of social thriving is a profound insight, not just in economics and in history, but in the fields that sit adjacent in the humanities and the social sciences. And this is characteristic of the way in which everything that Naomi does expands the boundaries of what seemed to be a simple question to illuminate for us the profound interrelations across fields. It's no accident that Naomi was fully jointly appointed in 2 departments at this university, that she was also affiliated with our business school, the School of Management, and with our law school, the School of Law. And that even as she was in 4 separate places, she was the most powerful and effective chair that I worked with during my first half-decade as dean. Naomi's work as chair of the history department exemplifies one of the things that she speaks about, the capacity of individual citizens to form an organization, in this case, the organization of, let's say, New Haven historians, who are both tightly connected and profoundly disagree with one another about fundamental matters, both intellectual and practical. I learned from Naomi's management of that group of 50 faculty how to engage in my own management of 50 department chairs. And Naomi, in that regard, you were deeply and profoundly my teacher. But you weren't, as in all classes, but you weren't just my teacher. Naomi is an extraordinary teacher. And one of the privileges I have as the Dean of Faculty of Arts and Sciences is that I have access to the long narrative comments that our students pro-socially, as part of a wonderful social equilibrium, provide to their teachers and to future generations of students. So let me read you some of the things that Naomi's students said about hers. Here's one of my favorites. I would read the papers before class and be bored, but when she expounded them in class, in the context of history, it all became enthralling. Enthralling is a term that I think captures many of our experiences with Naomi. Professor Lamoreaux was the perfect instructor for this class regarding assignments and exams. She used them, did I accidentally advance all of the slides as I tapped my fingers, fidgeting? So this is,
What it is to be a dean.
what it is to be a dean is that you accidentally move the academic conversation to a place where nobody wanted to be yet, but they will be soon, I promise. Just look at the departments we've created. We've renamed or reshaped 7 of our FAS departments during the deanship, and they were all instances of accidentally and kind of on purpose advancing the slides. All right, back to the wonderful student. Naomi would ask students to pull insights from the whole class together, ask them to ask and answer interesting questions based on primary resources. Both tasks were challenging, but they provided me with the skills that were helpful to me both during my time at Yale and after. And a comment from a student on your writing assignments. Professor Lamoreaux is an incredible professor. Her writing assignments were some of the best, most thought-provoking assignments I have ever had. An English writing tutor I work with wants to steal her prompts since he saw how they forced me to approach the material in many ways. Naomi is officially appointed in several of our departments, but through her leadership and example, I think during my decade as FAS Dean, there were few, if any, colleagues who touched so many. And it's an incredible honor to be here with you. I normally leave after I give these introductions. I'm staying for this opening panel because everything that Naomi does and that all of you do alongside her is so profoundly central to understanding what it is to be a human being, what it is to be an academic, what it is to be an individual who seeks to disseminate and create knowledge. Naomi Lamoreaux, you have been the heart of Yale during my time here, and I'm so grateful for the chance to listen to your colleagues celebrate your contributions.
Thank you, Tamar, for that wonderful introduction. And it certainly made my task easier as the chair, since I think all I need to do is now turn to introducing my panel. So our first panel is on history, economics, and policy, the importance of doing history forward. And when I sent out an email about the panel to the panelists, they all responded enthusiastically with the many ways in which they saw Naomi's work, both having influenced them, but also having led to this. So I'll start by inviting Professor Daniel Ruff, who is Associate Professor of Management at the Wharton School and Associate Professor of History in the School of Arts and Science, and a lecturer in the Law School at the University of Pennsylvania, and a long-term research associate at NBR, to start us off on this topic. So Dan, over to you.
Thank you very much. Am I audible? Yes. And sorry, how do I advance the slides? Good. So I should say two things before starting. One is that I'm going to talk about doing history forward in a way that may well not be taken up by any of my co-panelists, but it is true to her works, and that's what survives us as academics, our works. The second is that Naomi made me promise not to talk about her. So it's all going to be indirect. It's all going to be through some ideas and confined to 2 slides. So this will be narrative, and it begins with Marty Feldstein, who was a Harvard economics professor, served as the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Reagan administration, came back to Harvard, and of course they wanted him to run the big undergraduate Introduction to Economics lecture. So he looked over the syllabus and decided that he really had nothing to give the students to read about the theory of the firm. He was also the president of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and so he went to a small group of the NBER economic historians who he thought must have some interest in what happens inside of firms, and gave us some money and asked us to organize some conferences and publish some materials that he could assign in this course. So Naomi and Peter Tamman and I proceeded to do this. It resulted in 3 University of Chicago Press volumes, I think all still in print, all interesting, framed in relatively conventional economist sorts of ways, but beginning to get at not conventional economist sorts of subjects. A handful of these essays are brilliant and worth rereading, but they're all pretty interesting and they're all assignable in the sort of context that Feldstein had in mind. Well, we finished with this. We had an architecture design for it, and we got to the end of that, but it was fun. And we were enjoying working together. So the question was what to do next. And being across the river from the Harvard Business School and having the subject that we did, Alfred Chandler and the Visible Hand was the obvious next target. And so that we pursued in a paper that still reads interestingly and easily, I think, though not entirely. It has not been entirely a faithful predictor of what happened in the economy subsequently. But it's an interesting essay, and you can read it in the AHR of 2003. There's some further commentary in a symposium in Enterprise and Society the following year. The core idea of this is that anybody who's interested in the development of firms and the evolution of industrial organization in a very broad sense has to be interested in how embedded actors decide what to do, or perhaps decide not to do anything at all. But it has to have some role for the agency of individual actors within enterprises. And they, of course, don't know how things are going to turn out when they make decisions. It's not even clear in retrospect that they always grasp what all of the alternative possible ways of proceeding from whatever the circumstances and routines and practices which are in place in any given moment not necessarily obvious what all the variety of possible ways forward might be. Never mind how actual and potential competitors might react, never mind whether causal relationships they may imagine following on from their own initiatives might proceed. So the core idea of all of this was to write history from a forward-looking perspective, to try to identify actors, potential actors, at junctures at which they could make consequential decisions. And then to try to see the decisions they took, the actions they made, and how all that played out without knowing, without knowledge on the part of these actors as to what was going to happen. That's the core of that. Now, some particulars of the analysis, which are rather different from certainly what I was taught in economics graduate school. First of all, there's no assumption that anything is in equilibrium, in a state of equilibrium. Still less are there assumptions other than what you can find in the traces of these embedded actors of out of equilibrium dynamics, still less differential equations to describe those. Second big point, there's no end to time as far as these embedded actors are concerned. Just sense-making and agency in the moment, in successive specific moments. So in those moments, there may be challenges, maybe everything's going well. There may be opportunities which are visible to these actors, maybe not so visible, but latent and something that could be worked up. And what the focus of a study of decision-making is about the sense-making and the agency viewed prospectively, rather than reduced to observation and measurement of a set of outcomes. Now, my sense from the title of this conference is that a lot of the focus is going to be on addressing a certain large set of people who are curious about what can be learned from the past about the future. I would say that history written in this fashion is, to a very substantial extent, of interest to a different set of actors, a very large set of actors, but a different set of actors, people who are going to be responsible for making decisions inside of individual enterprises. And those decisions are always going to be, as a practical matter, in settings in which they don't know as much as they would like to know. They don't know as much as it would even be possible to know, but they have to make up their minds what to do or whether to stay their hands in order for the rest of the organization to go about their business, to do what they need to do on a day-to-day basis to make the enterprise proceed. I have been teaching in business schools for almost the whole of my career, and this is, in fact, the sort of education about what you would broadly consider economic history that these people want to know about. They don't always know when they enter business school or undergraduate business education that it's what they want to know about. They often think, like many entering economics graduate students, that they need to learn a bunch of fancy techniques. But certainly at the high end of the business school ecology, these are people who only in the first few years of their careers are going to execute techniques. They're going to employ people for most of their careers to do that. What they need to do is make resource and strategic allocation decisions at an executive sort of level. And the sort of wisdom that you can acquire from studying systematically cases of embedded actors, trying to figure out what's going on, what the choices are, what they might do, turns out to be extraordinarily valuable to them and a much more fun, I may say, way of teaching American business history than, in effect, replicating Chandler's text. So we worked on this, Naomi and Peter and I. This is mostly 20 years ago. Now, time passes, people get interested in other things. Naomi in particular has many friends and begins to collaborate with many of them. So maybe 15 years ago, she and I stopped having conversations about this as she became preoccupied with other things. I'm an obsessive, so I didn't. I'll just mention in passing before yielding the floor, that I have continued working on this. There are actually some interesting new developments in this in joint work with Carlos Baldwin. Carlos and I are enriching the notion original to that American Historical Review article of what the operating environments and available production technologies of firms are. You'll get a sense of this from her book that's forthcoming from the MIT Press this fall. And I've mostly been occupied with the last of these sub-bullets here, taking the context of all this to be organization seriously and taking agency in the philosophical sense in which agency is something distinct from actions seriously. I grew up in the civil service suburbs of DC, and in the spirit of that, I yield the remainder of my time to the gentleman from California, from Massachusetts, and the gentlewoman from Connecticut. Oh, so it is.
Thank you very much. I think Jean-Laurent now. So Jean-Laurent Rosenthal is a professor at Caltech who is trying to understand what institutions encourage long-term economic growth and wealth formation. He holds a bachelor's degree in history from Reed College and a PhD in social science from Caltech. Jean-Laurent, over to you.
I work at an Institute of Technology, which means I don't understand technology. So unlike Dan, I made no promises to Naomi, so I am going to talk about my experiences working with Naomi for 25 years. And I want to use this in a way of thinking about this as patience, positivity, and vision. But before that, I want to recognize the students with whom I had the honor to work with and with Naomi in the days of UCLA, many of whom had come from very far. And our legacy, and Naomi's legacy in particular, is embedded in all the people who are here who studied with Naomi, and I think that's an incredibly important issue. So I had read both Naomi's Insider Lending and the book on the Great Merger Movement because they're books you have to read. And then one day my colleague Ken Sokoloff said we should hire Naomi Lamoreaux. I was like, looking, can we do that? And in 1996, Naomi came to UCLA. And in the winter of 1995, she was visiting, and we had at that time, 3 months old, and we were incompetent parents. And Ken brought her over to our house, and the only thing we wanted to do is go to sleep. And somehow Naomi understood this, but Ken, who was in certain times tone deaf, didn't. And so they were there for a couple hours, and at that point my wife said, "You're never having social scientists again." Now Naomi didn't take very long to fix this problem. And then after she arrived, she said to me, "You know, partnerships and corporations do things, but we don't understand why there's one and when there's the other. And maybe we could do this by looking at France and the US." And I think my first response to Naomi was something like, "This is uninteresting," or "I don't have time." I was working on peer-to-peer lending, which I spent 30 years of my life working on, to not the great collection of a huge number of citations, but to a great deal of pleasure. Around 1999, Naomi kept asking this question once every 6 months. And around 1999, as a result of doing some stuff on Paris, I noticed that in the mortgage contracts, next to the mortgage contracts, there were these partnership contracts and corporation contracts. And in it were published they were appended little excerpts of things that were published in the newspaper. And I said to Naomi, well, if you want to study this, we can get the microfilms from the newspapers and then start collecting data. Because from my point of view, any real serious economic history issue has to start by collecting some data somewhere about something. It's not theory. Theory comes a little later. So 1999, and at the time we had large numbers of undergraduates desperate to get extra credit, so we put them to work. So this is the first part of patience, right? She waited 3 years for me to get my act together about this. And this led us to work for about a decade on issues of minority oppression and untimely dissolution, which were seeking to answer two questions. One is, once the corporation became relatively easily available, in particular in the US around 1850 to 1860 across all states, why did partnerships maintain a very large share of all the firms that existed in, you can look in the industrial census, for example, and also other places like that. And in the French case, why did the partnerships survive into the 1920s? And the argument is you had a choice to either be in a corporation where somebody would have control extract private benefits of control, essentially steal from the firm because they had control. They could make decisions that favored themselves. And remember, to go back to Dan's point, people who have agency will do things that are good for them, whatever that means. We have to figure that out, but that's what they would do. Or you could be in a partnership, and this is the case where all of a sudden the project kind of blew up on us in a really interesting way, where if a partnership as defined in the US is an at-will organization, and in particular is essentially dissolved as soon as one person happens to do something stupid like die. And in the 19th century, people die at relatively high rates, which means that you have a problem, and essentially either you can figure out a quick way to reconstitute the partnership, or you have to liquidate, and we all know that small firms have very low liquidation value, and that's a risk that you avoid with the corporation because the corporation lives independently of its owners. So that was the idea, and then we went to France, or I went to France. Naomi came to France once. In the French case, you could contract all these problems away. You could make the heirs of one of the general partners silent partners. You could avoid dissolving the partnership. So we had started this comparative issue, and at some point we were joined by Ron Harris, who knew a lot of legal history and firm history in England, and Tim Ganane, who added Germany. And these were challenging issues because working across 4 countries with different legal traditions, this is the positivity part. It's like Naomi will always find a way to solve the how to go forward problem. Thank you. I only have one more. But we did end up in a dead end. So one of the things that we discovered is sometime between 1892 and 1970, notice it's a wide range of time across the 4 different economies, some legal reform allowed corporations to structure their governance articles however they wanted. As in, we will make Naomi our dictator. You can write that in a private contract. Not until relatively late for the US. And so, if you have freedom of contract and you have 2 companies facing the same governance problem in 2 different countries, they should do the same thing. They don't. We got stuck. So then I went off and became dean. It seemed like a good idea. It was a terrible idea, but that's fine. I'm very stubborn, so that lasted 8 years. And at about the time I was getting done, I started realizing in between we'd had conversations, and one of the things that was interesting to us and became interesting to me, and this is the playing forward. So in the 1990s, the standard rule in corporate governance was at IPO, firms surrender control. They sell 51% of the shares of the voting stock to the market. And then Google said, why bother? We want to do, at the time, they said good for the world. And they created dual class shares, and people said, this is not the American equilibrium, and maybe it's not legal. It actually turns out there was never any loss and you can do it. So they did it. And then large numbers of companies since then that are close to profitability when they go to IPO have used dual class shares. And so there's an issue, why do entrepreneurs want control? And it's not an obvious question. There are certain statements about, well, one is they want to steal. This is the private benefit story, but that didn't seem quite right. And so after a while, after a failed model, we went back and we started working on this issue again. And I think it's really interesting. And it's interesting because we face these problems historically. You can look in the 1890s or around 1900. You can even go back to 1850. You can go back to formation of Dutch East India Company. And in cases after case, issues of control are different from issues of capital. And so they're interesting research questions. So then I want to end with vision. So the way we do things is we collect data on the countries that we're interested in. We work together. And at some point, we decide to write a model down. And usually I get stuck. And Naomi is a better theorist than I am, in the sense that she knows what the equilibrium should look like, even though she doesn't write any of the math down. And I have to figure out what it is that I did wrong, that it produces this stupid result. And it's what is the assumption that I made that, in fact, when you go back to the economics, is not the assumption you should make. And so 25 years of working with Naomi on questions that I would never have worked on. It's been an incredible privilege. And it's been a way to discover a different way of doing comparative economic history than I had ever thought of. And so, thank you.
I now invite Claire Priest, who is the Simeon Baldwin Professor at Yale Law School with a secondary appointment in Yale's History Department. Over to
Thank you. Well, it's so wonderful to be here to celebrate Naomi Lamoreaux's amazing achievements. I mean, she has redefined many fields within economic history through her brilliant work. Her scholarly rigor is a model of excellence that we all aspire to, and her generosity as a friend and critic have vastly improved the work of countless people, making the entire field more nuanced and just better. So I have chosen to focus my comments on a fantastic article Naomi published in the Journal of Economic History called The Mystery of Property Rights. I teach property law at Yale Law School, and this essay of Naomi's asks a very deep question in economic history and for those teaching property law, and I decided to grapple more deeply with the article, which I think really raises a lot of very profound issues and actually some problems for the field. And in thinking about kind of going forward, I think it's really important to grapple with. So the essay begins with noting that it's an article of faith in the field of economic history that strong property rights are needed for economic development. This has been generally accepted from the work, Douglas North forward, going back, I think, to the Scottish Enlightenment, and in fact, we could even say the Romans had probably figured out that the importance of property rights to commerce. But in contrast to this sort of foundational principle, Naomi probes the profound question of how it is the U.S. has been able to maintain the society's belief in secure property rights when in so many instances the government has intervened to override property rights. So it turns out in critical moments, weak property rights have been the path forward, which is something that economic historians haven't generally focused on. I mean, actually, Jean-Laurent Rosenthal had a brilliant essay on how it was important in the French Revolution that the Republican government got the power of eminent domain to override property rights that blocked commerce. And Naomi builds on this work and goes farther and carefully examines many historical and recent instances of government measures violating property rights, from the mill dam laws of the 19th century that affected water rights, to the abolition of slavery, to many, many instances of government using eminent domain to violate property rights. And so the essay addresses the paradox or the mystery that despite the fact the government has often overridden existing property rights, Americans still maintain this belief that property rights are secure, which leads to investment and growth that's advanced us into our modern capitalist world. So the essay concludes that the key to this paradox is that the citizenry of the United States has been largely constituted by property owners. So the widespread ownership of property in the United States has prompted voters to mobilize whenever redistribution or reallocation gets out of hand to maintain the security of property rights overall. So a great example is the backlash to the most recent Supreme Court case, it's now like 20 years old, but the most recent case about eminent domain that went to the Supreme Court, the Kelo case of New London, which led people to feel vulnerable about that their property would be taken by eminent domain. And so there's a backlash, and the public, people responded, and state legislatures across the country passed laws restricting government's use of eminent domain. So having this broad base of property owners and democracy makes property owners feel confident that property rights are secure even when the government's overriding them. And as I mentioned, I think this article creates a lot of problems for traditional approaches to economic history. So I'm going to mention some things I think are important takeaways and from the article that inform our theme of history looking forward. And I'm also going to link those ideas to my current research project. I figured, knowing Naomi, I knew she wanted to go away with some new material. So I was just not going to focus on her material, but I had to, this is not in the spirit of taking away from Naomi, but giving her what I know she wants.
Thank you, Claire. Our last speaker is David Moss, who is the Paul Whitten Cherrington Professor at the Harvard Business School, where he chairs the Business Governor International Economy Unit. He earned his BA from Cornell and his PhD from Yale. So, David, over to you.
Well, let me just grab this here. So it was fun hearing these other comments, and it's a thrill to be here celebrating Naomi. I'm just delighted by that. I mean, when you heard already, but just when you stop and think, what an extraordinary scholar, a giant in the field of economic history, and also even above and beyond that, just an absolutely wonderful person. My guess is everyone in this room knows that, but it's really stunning. So in any case, I think I could probably spend my minutes and probably tenfold after that, which I think Tim would be upset about, heaping praise on Naomi. Naomi's shaking her head no. She also did not instruct me not to do this. So I'm going to do a little of it, but I'm going to try to do it through a particular lens. So I want to talk about the interactions that we've had in connection with an organization that I helped to start a number of years ago, and that Naomi's been very involved in, and ever since, and including up to today. So this organization is called the Tobin Project. And we started it in 2006, and it was named after James Tobin. So I'm glad to be back at Yale. And I wasn't on the faculty ever at Yale, but I was a student in both the history and the economics department. So I'm pleased to be able to at least have that connection. So when I was in the economics department, I had Jim Tobin was my macro teacher. And he ended up taking an interest in me, and he invited me out to lunch, which was, again, thrilling, like being here today. And so we went, I don't know if you remember Clark's Dairy. So we went over from Hill House to Clark's Dairy, and if I think they closed some years back, but if you remember, those who were there or have seen it, Clark's Dairy had these pictures, like many diners, pictures of famous people who've been there, and one of them was Jim Tobin. And somehow we always sat within good view of his picture. But anyway, we had lunch probably every month or two for the rest of my time at Yale, which was one of the highlights of the experience. And one of the things he would come back to again and again was, and he later wrote this down, so I sort of know the exact words that he would use, and I'll use them, but what he broadly told me was that the most important decision a scholar makes is what problems to work on. And he said, David, when you get further in your career and you're deciding what you're going to work on, just make sure you don't spend your time trying to fill little gaps in the literature. He said, you'll move ahead in your career that way, and in the profession, but you won't be doing your job. And it was a curious thing, I thought, to say. And one time when we were walking from Hill House again to Clark's Dairy, he looked around, he waved his arms like this. He said, look at everything that's here. Yale is supported by private donations, by public donations, by tax-free status. We are expected to be producing something that is of value to society. And that can be done in many ways, but we need to advance knowledge on problems of importance. So when you pick a topic, when you pick a question, which anyway, I'll come back to Naomi in a second because she's such a master at this, but pick a problem of first order importance, not of secondary or third order. Pick a problem of first order importance and try to understand it and try to deepen understanding of it. Then you'll be doing your job. So I was quite struck by those types of comments, which again, he said repeatedly. And so he passed away in 2002, and in 2006, I decided to start this organization named after him, which was the goal of the Tobin Project was exactly to encourage scholars and to help scholars focus on important problems and not just to fill. I mean, it's important to fill gaps in literature. Don't get me wrong. I think he thought that was important as well, but that shouldn't be the primary goal. That should be a consequence of working on important problems. So anyway, started this organization, and the goal was to bring together scholars from a range of disciplines and economics, political science, sociology, law, history, others, and to try to think about, can we work together in addressing some important problems and deepening understanding in kind of aspiring to the kind of vision that Tobin had laid out. And so there were a number of challenges. There was a lot of excitement. I loved doing being part of the Tobin Project. But one of the problems, or one of the challenges we faced very, very early on, for sort of, if I can put it bluntly, was what to do with historians. And the reason I say that, now I'm a historian, right? So, but what to do? And the problem is that as we tried to attack current problems in the world, we had to be extremely careful. Like, there was a temptation, I think, to sort of scratch around in history, find some examples that were relevant or that seemed relevant, and then kind of come to a conclusion based on that. And that's sort of, often called presentism, and it's weak history. And so what we thought is that can't be the model. If that's the model, we're in real trouble. And so historians had to do something a little different from the others, which is they had to think about what was the broad contours of the issue or the problem we're trying to tackle. And then think about, how can I shape a question? I think it's okay to use current issues or current problems to help broadly shape or guide a question. But then we have to do our history, kind of let the history speak. And we have to go and try to do sound history. And if it turns out to be relevant, great. And if it doesn't, well, that's it. And we're not going to force it. So as we came up with that kind of design, I started to look around. I had known Naomi's work from graduate school. I don't think David Wyman is here, but David Wyman was my teacher of economic history, also at Hill House. And I think that might be the first time I started reading The Great Merger Movement, and Insider Banking came later. And in any case, so I knew Naomi, but as I started thinking about who did this best, that is, really do deep history that ends up being of remarkable relevance, Naomi was at the top of the list. And so I was excited when a little over a year later, we had sort of our first big conference on regulation. And so we invite this giant in the field, and I'm pretty sure she's going to say no. And not only does she come to the conference, and she's incredibly actively engaged in the conference, but she came up to the organizers and to me and others and said, she loved what we were doing. And there was just a kindness and sort of an affirming nature that I will never forget. And she challenged us on a couple areas, which is her one, and it was incredibly welcome. So that's kind of the person that she is. And I can say since that conference, I've gotten to observe and watch Naomi in many different contexts, seminars and meetings and conferences of various kinds. And what is striking, and I'm sure everyone in this room probably already knows this, but maybe I just wanted to put it on the record, Naomi elevates, this is sort of the best kind of description I could come to, she elevates every conversation that she is a part of. And I don't mean just in-person conversations, those for sure, but also within the literature. She elevates, and just think about it for a minute, and I think if you think about the context in which you know her work, my guess is you'll see this is true. She elevates every conversation, and I think she does it in two ways. One is the quality of the contribution she's bringing, which we've heard about a little bit already, but also, I think equally important, how she challenges and inspires everyone around her to set their sights higher than they would otherwise. And I saw this so clearly when she was running a project on the Corporation and American Democracy with Bill Novak, who is a great historian, and he's not here today, but when they had a meeting with all the authors, she had some pretty strong ideas about what some of the authors should be doing and what might strengthen the papers. And when we talked before the meeting, I was I have to admit, a little bit concerned about how this was going to go. And it went beautifully. I want to go back to what the dean said. It was like a masterclass in just watching how to interact and give feedback. She was so deeply engaged with the paper. With each author, she would talk about the paper, what she read, what she liked about it, what she was concerned about. And it was like she was embracing the work so strongly that when then, she got to the criticism, which some of it was pretty tough, it was welcomed, and people were writing it down furiously. And I was thinking, wow, this is the way you move a project forward. And so I was really excited about that. I could give more examples, but I think Tim's going to throw me off the stage soon. So maybe I'll just end by saying this. Don't forget about this elevation of discussion, because the more that we can a little bit be like Naomi, the better our world will be. So that's one thing. And second, I just want to thank her for how much she's taught me about when you try to write history, how do you write history that can be relevant without falling into the trap of presentism? And so I was quite struck by what she's taught in that respect. And I must admit, I was then kind of surprised. There was this, there was an interview with Naomi that was done by the by the Economic Growth Center that was for this conference. And the last question asked was, how do you think economic history can help us think about today's economic challenges? So this is the very last thing she says in a moderately long interview. So I'm going to read, with your permission, Naomi, from this is her speaking, not me, but I certainly agree. She says there are a lot of cliches, like people being doomed to repeat history if they don't learn from it. My view is that you shouldn't look to history if your only goal is to find problems that are similar to today's problems, because that imposes a present-day view on the past, and it assumes that people then actually faced the same problems or had the same goals. Instead, what I think you should do is just study the past and think hard about what you're learning. Once you understand it, then you can come back and ask, how does this change the way we think about the present? So as is so often the case, I think she had it exactly right. And thank you, Naomi.
Thank you, David. That was fantastic. And I think that's probably a great note for us to stop here and head to the reception. So I invite all of you to join us in a reception for Naomi. And Naomi, thank you again.